This is Robert Kaplan from the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia. This is a podcast series about great power rivalry in an age of global demons.
If Russia continues to interfere with our democracy, I'm prepared to take further actions to respond.
Cyber attacks on the United States, economic coercion.
The United States does not have the qualification to say that it wants to speak to China from a position of strength.
How will conflicts between the United States and China and between the United States and Russia interact with pandemics, climate change, massive cyber attacks, state failures, and other terrors of a global media age? You'll want to listen closely to the breaks because you might be one of the lucky listeners to receive my latest book, The Good American, The Epic Life of Bob Gersony, the U.S. government's greatest humanitarian, as part of a giveaway. With me is Chris Miller, an assistant professor at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, and also the director of the Eurasia program at FPRI. And Chris is really an expert on Eurasia and Russia and all things related to that. So let me just jump right into it, Chris. What does Putin want in his near abroad? To start with a big question. Does he want to informally reconstitute the Soviet Union? Because he's been taking a lot of actions of late, indirectly in Belarus, more directly in massing troops in Ukraine. What are his goals?
I think if you start at the highest level, Bob, what the Russian government wants, and Putin personally, but it's not just him, it's the entire Russian elite, what they want is for Russia to be seen and treated as a great power in international politics. And from the Russian perspective, there are today three great powers in the world. There's the United States, there's China, and there's Russia. These are the three countries that can provide for their own security via conventional and nuclear military forces. And as a result, these are the three countries that the Russian elite believes ought to structure all of international politics. One of the things you naturally want if you're a great power is your own sphere of influence, a set of countries around your border that you control. And viewed from Moscow, places like Belarus, Ukraine, the Caucasus region, Central Asia, are naturally part of Russia's sphere of influence. And Russia believes that to the extent that they've left Russia's sphere of influence over the past couple of years, it's time to return them.
Does Putin and his circular elites around him, do they make a distinction between places that were inside the Soviet Union and places that were outside the Soviet Union, but inside the Warsaw Pact? Like Belarus was inside the Soviet Union, whereas Poland was outside as a member of the Warsaw Pact. Did they make a distinction in their long-term goals, or is it fuzzier than that?
I think it is a bit fuzzier than that. There are certainly parts of the world that were outside of the Soviet Union where Russia today sees itself as having substantial interests, Syria, for example. There are places that were in the Soviet Union that Russia today sees as outside of its sphere of influence, like the Baltic countries, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania. When it comes to Europe, I think the key dividing line in Russia's thinking today is actually which countries are part of NATO and which are not. Russia realizes that it can't do much to meddle in NATO member states. It can do a little in the cyber sphere and the information sphere, but ultimately those are outside of its sphere. Whereas any country that's in Europe but not in NATO is, in the Russian mind, a place of contestation and ultimately a country that Russia would like to get in its own sphere.
So that Russia is very clear, it wants to avoid a military conflict with the United States. It doesn't even want a chance one. It wants to bring things up to the limit, if I understand you.
That's right. And Russia realizes that given the tools that it has, it's got strong military tools, it's got relatively weak economic tools, it's got even weaker soft power tools. The military tool is a natural place for Russia to turn when it wants to exercise leverage, which is why you've repeatedly seen Russia turn to its military in Georgia, in Ukraine, and in other places. And when Russia wants to get something in the international sphere, especially in Europe, military threats are one of the most effective ways Russia has to achieve what it wants. But military threats are intended just to be threatening, just to extract concessions. And Russia hopes that it can avoid any sort of large-scale war with the United States in the process.
Chris, dissect for a few moments what Putin seems to be doing at present, because the present moment seems like a textbook case of Russia's aggression, kind of. You have Belarus, which is clearly under the influence of Russia, Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko. And Belarus has been flying refugees from the Middle East to harass the Polish border because Poland is inside the EU and the refugees want to get inside the EU where they can claim asylum. Lukashenko, and one supposes Putin moving this refugee crisis. And then Lukashenko has said that if the Europeans don't play ball, he can always cut off gas deliveries. So you have that on one hand. And on the other hand, you have Russia moving substantial numbers of troops back to near the Ukrainian border, and not for any prearranged exercise or pre-scheduled exercise. Are the two related? And what does this say about how Putin operates?
I think they are related, and they're related as well to the gas crisis we see in Europe right now. From the perspective of Russia, this, I think, appears to be a time where the Russian elite believes it can extract some concessions from the West. When it comes to Ukraine, Russia wants to bring Ukraine back into its sphere of influence, which the Ukrainian government and Ukrainian people have signaled they don't want, but that's ultimately the Russian goal. When it comes to Belarus, which is already pretty clearly in Russia's sphere of influence, Russia sees a lever that it can be used to pressure Europe, while claiming that it's not Russia doing the pressuring, it's Belarus, a separate independent country, even though it's pretty clear Russia is quite supportive of Belarus's actions. And I think more broadly, when looking at Western countries and the United States in particular, Russia sees European and American leaders as distracted by their own internal concerns, by domestic political debates, but also by other foreign policy crises. And when Russia looks at the United States and sees all of the attention American leaders are paying towards the Indo-Pacific and China in particular, there's a sense in Russia that that might mean that America is not withdrawing from Europe, but less willing to devote attention towards European affairs because it's got to devote more attention towards the Indo-Pacific. And if that's true, and it does seem to be true, then Russian leaders think that they might have a bit more scope to press the United States and Europe and extract some concessions. And if you look at what's happening in Belarus, you look at what's happening in Ukraine, I think it's not simply about the specific regional disputes, those are important, but also about the broader context of trying to assess, is the US willing to stand up in European security affairs as it has the past couple of decades, or is it turning its attention to Asia and turning away from Europe?
It seems to me that what Russia is trying to do in Ukraine and Belarus, on a larger note, is to insert Russia as a pivotal factor in European politics, to put Europe in a position where it is really in the fight zone between the US and Russia and in trade with China. Does that sink well?
I think that's right. If you think about what Russia is trying to accomplish at the broader European level, what Russian leaders often talk about is a new Yalta-style agreement, a division of the continent between the United States and Russia, where Russia gets its sphere and the US gets its own sphere. And from the American perspective, Yalta was a betrayal of Eastern Europe. It was a decision to send the Poles and the Czechoslovaks and the Hungarians to their fate of Russian domination or Soviet domination during the Cold War. But from the Russian perspective, Yalta was a success. It made Russia a great power in Europe. It divided the continent in a relatively stable way. And so Russia would be very happy to do a new Yalta deal where the US and Russia would carve up the continent. And from the European perspective, that's obviously not very attractive. Europe wants to be in charge of its own destiny, not to have geopolitical futures dictated to it by either Washington or Moscow. But from the Russian perspective, that's a very appealing option. And if it can try to talk and pressure Americans into that sort of deal, that's something the Russians would happily sign up for.
That would be incredible, because that would undo the gains of the victory in the Cold War. It would essentially create, informally, of course, a new Warsaw Pact, a new dividing line with Germany as neutral. It wouldn't be like an iron curtain where, something physical dividing Europe, but it would be metaphorically in terms of trade and influence, very much like going back to the Cold War.
Yeah, I think that the Cold War analogy that I like to use is of Ostpolitik, when in the middle of the Cold War, in Germany in particular, but other Western European countries, the view emerged that it was time to improve relations with the Soviet Union, improve economic ties, and find a way to reduce Cold War tensions, which succeeded for a time in reducing Cold War tensions, but at the cost of increasing Soviet leverage over European countries. There's certainly a faction of European leaders that would be interested in that today, and Russia's done everything it can to strengthen them and to support them in that effort.
For our listeners, Ospolitik was a foreign policy of West Germany at the time. It was very brilliantly promoted by long-serving foreign minister in that era, Hans-Dietrich Genscher, who basically saw an opportunity to soften the distance between West and East Germany, and for West Germany to have its own foreign policy of sorts rather than be under the thumb of the United States. And of course, it started really with Willy Brandt, I would say, who was a former mayor of Berlin and German chancellor. The Nixon administration thought they were naive, but they went along with them because they had to, in a way. They had to give Germany the illusion of foreign policy independence.
And I think also there was a school of thought in the United States at the time associated with people like Henry Kissinger that it was a good idea to try out Ostpolitik, that it might work in reducing Cold War tensions. And I think you can argue that it worked for a couple of years, but the long-term effect was certainly to increase tensions because it threw a lifeline to the Soviet Union, while giving them a chance to divide the Western alliance. And my concern today about similar proposals of improving ties with the Russians by giving them more influence in European affairs is that it will again divide the transatlantic alliance without actually extracting any sort of meaningful concessions on the policies that are making Europe less secure.
Can the West realistically defend Ukraine? Because as I see it, at the end of the day, Ukraine will always matter more to Russia than it matters to Europe and certainly to the United States. It's geographically part of Russia. It's surrounded on 2 or 3 sides with no mountains or anything between them. The languages are very similar. And of course, historically, Russians view Ukraine as the birthplace of historic Russia in the 9th century. If Russia will always care more about Ukraine and what happens there than the West, I would assume the Russians would be willing to take more chances in terms of their policy towards Ukraine than the West.
I think that's right. And that's really shaped the crisis in Ukraine that's been ongoing for the past 7 years. If you listen to Western leaders, they will say things like, we're supportive of Ukrainian sovereignty, we reject Russia's efforts to seize and annex Ukrainian territory. But very few Western leaders have openly said that the West ought to defend or extend security guarantees to Ukraine. When the US and UK signed the Budapest Memorandum in 1994 with Ukraine, it was written in a way that would explicitly make it sound like it was supportive of Ukraine, but not extend explicit security guarantees. And NATO had an opportunity to extend a membership action plan to Ukraine about a decade ago and chose not to after some debate within the alliance. So I think there's been a pretty deliberate choice among Western leaders not to try to defend Ukraine. What they have been willing to do and have done increasingly over the past couple of years is support Ukraine in its ability to defend itself by providing weaponry, by providing financial support, by diplomatically backing the Ukrainians. And because the majority of Ukrainians don't want to be in the Russian sphere of influence, as we've seen after a series of political revolts and revolutions over the past several decades, Ukraine doesn't need Western security guarantees to be able to defend itself, although it does need a lot of Western support. And so I think the question now is, does the fact, as you say, that Russia cares more about Ukraine than we do, does that outweigh the fact that we can give Ukraine some meaningful support that might give them enough space for autonomy vis-a-vis Russia? Which of those factors is the most important? Now, that's still an open question. We see a lot of evidence that Russia is willing to escalate again militarily in Ukraine. Whether they do so, I think, is not yet clear because Russia fears diplomatic isolation. It fears sanctions that might come from that. It fears also that another war in Ukraine might be bloodier for Russia this time than it was last time. But it's certainly not guaranteed that Russia doesn't up the ante again, prove to the West that Russia does care more and is willing to deploy more resources, and potentially even prove to the Ukrainians that Russia's got decisive military advantage and can destroy the entire idea of Ukrainian statehood. I hope it doesn't come to that, but it certainly could over the next couple of years.
If Russia were to do that, if Russia were to launch an unambiguous invasion of Ukraine, what would be the effect in the West and in the EU? Would there be massive sanctions against Russia? And would that prospect dissuade Putin from trying this in the first place?
There certainly would be new sanctions against Russia, both from the EU and also from the US. And the way sanctions work, it doesn't actually really matter if the EU signs on to sanctions, because US unilateral sanctions are so powerful, as we've seen against Iran, for example. In recent years, the US can force European countries and companies not to do business with Russia by its own decision. So the US would certainly sanction Russia even more intensely than it already has. Whether that's enough to dissuade Russia, though, I'm not sure. I hope it is, but I worry that it isn't, because what we've learned from the Russian political elite over the past decade is that they don't care nearly as much about economic factors as a political science textbook might tell you that leaders ought to care about economic factors. Russia has experienced declining living standards for its population for most of the last decade, and it hasn't meaningfully impacted Putin's hold on power, nor has it meaningfully impacted Russian foreign policy. So I don't think we should assume that just because Western politicians are very keenly attuned to unemployment figures and GDP growth, that Russian leaders use the same calculus when thinking about foreign policy.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating insight. And that syncs well with Russian literature, which always emphasizes the ability of the population to suffer and to keep their heads bowed down. You see this in a lot of Russian novelists and all. If you read Solzhenitsyn, if you read Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, the unifying theme, or one of the unifying themes, is the ability of a population to sustain suffering for long periods.
Next to that, I would also say the desire of the Russian populace to see Russia as a great power, and in particular, the desire of the Russian elite to see Russia as a great power, is a lot more important in Russian politics than in many other countries, certainly than the US, certainly more important than in the big European powers like Germany or France. Russians place a lot of value on great power status. We hear Russian politicians talk about this on a quite regular basis, and Russia's willing to devote substantial resources to being seen as a great power in a way that to Western populaces often just doesn't compute.
Moving a little eastward from Ukraine, what is the Russian position in Central Asia, especially vis-a-vis China? Because it seems from the outside that the two are competitors there. How do the Russians view it? Is it a competition that both Russia and China can live with, that we shouldn't make too much of, or is there real tension there?
The official Russian view is that Russia and China are cooperating in Central Asia, that China is focusing primarily on economic methods of influence, building roads and bridges, for example, whereas Russia is dealing with security questions. If you talk to the Russian government, that's the line that they will give you. It's becoming increasingly harder to sustain, however, because China's security service and military presence in the region is growing. We've seen very clearly that Chinese security services expanding their footprint in Tajikistan, right north of Afghanistan. China is very concerned about the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, seeing the U.S. defeat as a victory, but also worried about what comes next. And across Central Asia, there are Chinese security forces, in particular Chinese private security contractors, that are expanding their footprint, expanding the number of personnel in place. So although Russia would like to sustain the fiction that it's the primary security provider in Central Asia, that's no longer really true. Now, President Putin has committed his administration to a friendship with China. Xi Jinping has been quoted as describing Vladimir Putin as his, quote, best friend. I don't believe that that's true, but it's interesting that the two leaders are willing to use phrases like that in describing their relationship. My view is that a lot of Russian leaders realize they've become too dependent on China, and they've been insufficiently wary of China's expansion in the territories around Russia. But because Putin has set up his relationship with Xi in this way, a person-to-person, leader-to-leader relationship, it's almost impossible in Russia to criticize it because you're seen as criticizing a core policy of Vladimir Putin. So I think that the Russians are actually naively tolerant of the expansion of Chinese influence in Central Asia. And at some point, they're going to realize that a region that was once dominated by Russia is now slipping out of their grasp.
When we come back, Chris and I will discuss the conflict in Ukraine and its role in the general rivalry between the West and Russia.
This podcast is sponsored by the Foreign Policy Research Institute, a nonpartisan think tank based in Philadelphia. Founded in 1955, FPRI is committed to producing the highest quality scholarship and expert analysis through the lens of history, geography, and culture. For more information about FPRI and our work to educate the public on the most pressing foreign policy issues of the day, please visit www.fpri.org.
It seems as if that Putin is more obsessed with challenging the West in Europe, in greater Europe, in the Ukraine and, the western border of the former Soviet Union, than he is obsessed with Central Asia. And Europe is something that really gets under his skin.
If you look at how the Russian elite sees the United States threat as they perceive it, they're not simply looking at the US military or NATO military forces. They're not simply looking at specific territories like Georgia or Ukraine or where NATO's deployed forces. They see the West in general as a threat to the security and stability of their own regime. Whereas China for them is simply a geopolitical actor, an actor that might move into certain regions or withdraw from others, an actor that might deploy military forces in certain ways that challenge or threaten Russia, but is not ultimately a threat to the stability of the Russian leadership's hold on power at home. And because of that, from the perspective of the Russian elite, the American and Western threat will always be more important because it's not just about specific geopolitical questions. It's about regime security and their own hold on power.
When he looks at the West, I assume, when he looks at Washington, what he sees is an elite that wants to see him gone, And him gone in the kind of system that he operates would mean really gone. Him and his family gone. Maybe dead, maybe imprisoned, or maybe just poor or something like that. Whereas he looks at China and he doesn't see that at all. He just sees like normal competition.
That's absolutely right. And what's, I think, striking is that although Western leaders regularly deny that they want to see Putin gone, as you put it, the reality is impossible to deny. Western leaders would be very happy to see Putin out of office tomorrow, and the Russian elite know that. And there's no way of getting around this basic fact that everyone in the West would prefer to see Putin gone, and the Russians believe that the West is taking every action it can to push him out of power.
Is the West naive here? Because the West always envisions a better outcome. Without Putin or without this guy or that guy, there would be a democracy and everyone would live happily ever after. But of course, you could probably draw up scenarios that without Putin, Russia could fall into some disarray and be even more dangerous.
That's absolutely right. We just don't know. Nobody knows what comes after Putin. It could be a stable transition of power to someone who looks very like Putin. It could be a transition to a more fractious or multi-party system like we saw in Russia in the 1990s. It could be a transition to someone who's far worse, far more aggressive, far more nationalistic than Putin. I think what we can say looking at Russian history is that it's not infrequent that transitions between long-serving leaders in Russia are accompanied by changes to Russia's borders, which is a prospect that ought to make us quite nervous. And it's also far from clear that when Putin leaves, the system he's put in place, not just the constitution, but the balance of power in the Russian political process will remain. And if that shifts, it could shift in a positive direction or it could shift in a negative direction. There's really no grounds for confidence about where it would head next.
Chris, what does Putin want from the United States? What would make him modestly satisfied? To say to himself, well, relations have improved somewhat.
I think ultimately Putin wants two main things from the US. First, he wants a recognition from the US that he is and will remain Russia's president, and that the US isn't trying to oust him by explicit or secretive means. Second, he wants to be treated like a leader of a great power, hosted at regular summits in Washington, consulted on the key issues of international politics, treated not as someone who is ostracized from key meetings, but someone who is always called by not just the US president, but by other Western leaders as well. Now, that might seem like something that's easy to offer him. Simply promise we're not going to try to overthrow you and call him on a regular basis. But I think the reality is that it's almost impossible to provide the Russian elite with the guarantee that Western society isn't going to threaten their regime, because the reality is that Western openness, that democratic ideals are threatening to Putin's hold on power. In addition to that, the status desire that Russian leaders want, the desire to be called on a regular basis, consult on international issues. Well, that sounds fine in theory, but what does that mean in practice? That means giving Russia a substantially larger voice in key issues in international politics. I'm not sure that we want to do that on a lot of key issues. Certainly when it comes to European politics, it's not clear that a larger Russian voice will lead to a better, safer, more peaceful, more prosperous Europe. And I think when you look at a lot of the crises around the world, many of them would be exacerbated by more Russian participation rather than improved.
When we come back, Chris Miller and I will discuss what conceivably comes after Putin.
If you're enjoying the Global Demons podcast, you'll also enjoy Robert D. Kaplan's latest book, The Good American, a sweeping yet intimate story of the most influential humanitarian you've never heard of, Bob Grissoni, who spent 4 decades in crisis zones around the world. Thanks to our sponsor, Random House, you can win a signed copy of The Good American just by listening to this podcast. All you have to do is subscribe to this podcast and leave a review on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast. We will have a random drawing and announce the winner on our 13th and final episode.
How stable is Putin? How healthy is he? Can he be in the same position of power and health like 5-10 years from now? Can he still be governing at the same level of energy?
Well, there are constant rumors about Putin's health. These rumors have been so constant that I tend to very aggressively discount their veracity. There's nothing remotely close to being confirmed about his health. We know that he's a senior citizen by any standard, but the world is governed by many men of his age who often hold on to power for a long time. You've probably heard that Russian male life expectancy is relatively low. That's primarily true because of men who die in their 20s and 30s. And if you're a Russian man who makes it to 65, you're more likely than not to continue living well into your early 80s. If you assume, as I do, that Putin's got better healthcare than the average Russian, we know he doesn't smoke or drink very often, I think our base assumption has got to be that Putin's got another decade of life, which I think means he's got another decade in power.
That's very sobering. Unless, of course, you think that after Putin, the deluge. Because has he built institutions, Chris, in the same way that, say, China has institutions? For instance, if Xi Jinping were to get very ill tomorrow, China would soldier on. It would elect a new party leader. There would be some rumbling and instability at the top, but it probably wouldn't last long. There would be a transition. Can you say the same thing about Russia, though?
I think there's no doubt that if Putin had a heart attack tomorrow, the constitution would be followed for the next couple of weeks. There would be a presidential transition. The state would continue to function as planned. What I think we can't say with confidence is what would come in the months that followed. The institutions that really matter in Russia are less the formal legal institutions. There's no party structure in Russia that really matters in the way the Communist Party of China matters. The institutions that really matter are the networks of personnel currently or formerly in the security services who really run the country. And it's often said that the Russian government is a KGB state. I think you can read too much into phrases like that, but there's no doubt that the key institutions in Russia are led by people who did formerly serve in the security services, many who served together alongside each other in the security services. And that's the core institution that undergirds Russian politics. It's not the laws, it's not the courts, it's not the parliament, it's this network of individuals. If Putin leaves, there are a lot of other people quite like him who would be capable of serving as Russia's president. What's not clear is whether they'd be able to agree amongst themselves as to who ought to be the next president. And if so, whether they'd be able to bring the rest of Russian politics and the rest of the Russian society along with them.
Final question, Chris. How would you define Putin's method of conflict management, of creation? Because when you look at the cyber attacks, the drama with Lukashenko in Belarus, threatening gas cutoffs, what I'm seeing is a very indirect way of warfare. And also where warfare is kind of total. It's not just soldiers marching back and forth. Like every aspect of policy contains an element of warfare in it.
There are two key facts that structure how the Russian elite does diplomacy and does warfare. And as you say, it's not always possible to distinguish between the two. One is that Russia wants a revision to the status quo. It can't do nothing because if it does nothing, the status quo will persist and Russia doesn't like the status quo. So it's got to be constantly acting, pushing against the US, pushing against our allies to change the status quo. But it also realizes that in a pure military sense, it can't take the US and NATO on head to head. So it's got to find other methods that are below the threshold of what would trigger us to respond militarily, but problematic enough to induce us to respond somehow, because it's got to produce some sort of response for us or else it can't revise the status quo. So Russia's constantly trying to prod the US, prod the West, prod our allies in a way that raises the costs for us, raises the temperature, makes it very uncomfortable for us in all of the different domains that you mentioned, but stays below the threshold of what would trigger a military response, because that would be a disastrous outcome for Russia. This is a risky game for Putin because he's got to constantly test where that line is, and he doesn't exactly know where it is. But unless he takes those risks, his foreign policy will fail and the status quo will persist. So he's got to keep trying, testing the boundary, raising the temperature and raising the risks, both for himself, but also for us.
Sobering and distinct. Thank you so much for joining us, Chris. It's been a pleasure to host you.
Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Global Demons podcast, brought to you by the Foreign Policy Research Institute. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe anywhere you get your podcasts and visit our website at www.fpri.org. For the Foreign Policy Research Institute, I'm Robert D. Kaplan.